Okay, so today is Saturday, June 24th, 2023. Today is the Nativity of the Forerunner, John the Baptist, or the birth of John the Baptist. And the readings are Luke 1 and Romans 13. So we talked in the last couple days about the relationship between the creation of the world and the election of human beings into Christ, who is the structure of the world as God's sacrifice to finitude. So under the conditions of sacrificial finitude, we might say with some theologians that the image of Christ in human beings presupposes, or is at least the conditions for, their election into the kingdom of God. And yet we identify that there also exists a tension within this existential condition between those who are more and less fully connected to it, without suggesting a hard and fast ontological distinction between the two. There is then, we might say, a relevant extra epistemic condition at the nexus of properties associated with salvation. To put it philosophically, we might say that an ontological binary, like salvation, yes or no, can be altered. An event can actualize a potential, even if the possibility of that actualization was always already latent in the ontological binary itself. So here the epistemic condition is the condition of the actualization of the ontological identity of creation and election. So if Christ is the latent structure of creation that assures salvation, then the actualization of salvation is the process of conversion, or following Eckhart, the birth of the Messiah in the soul. So that brings us to today's readings in the Orthodox calendar, which relate to the birth of John the Forerunner. So John the Forerunner, or John the Baptist, is a symbol of the coming of the Messiah, who baptizes the Messiah into the world. Psychologically, if salvation is, again, following Eckhart, the birth of the Messiah in the soul of the human being, the coming into consciousness of the isomorphism between the human being and the sacrificial structure of creation, then psychologically the birth of the baptizer of the Messiah is the conditions of the possibility of that coming into consciousness. So to talk about the conditions of the possibility of the coming into consciousness of the birth of the Messiah, we need to say quite a bit about what the birth of the Messiah in the soul of the human being means. So the psychological meaning of the messianic ministry of Jesus as the Christ is the introduction of what I would call psychological bonding factor, or that factor which mixes and makes cloudy and confused the distinction between self and other. So if Christ is the act of grace put to death under the rule of law, and law are those fixed systems intended to create protective, if immovable, boundaries between self and other, then we might say that Christ represents those new elements introduced into the psychosocial field that create, through this psychological bonding or confusion, a resulting and entheodramatic reaction of the law holders of the possibility of the law's transformation through his rejection. So essentially, Christ introduces grace into a system of law. Grace within that system of law has always already been rejected, and so the coming into the psychosocial field of a symbol of those rejected elements causes this psychological bonding, and then through the psychic rejection of those elements in the law holders, a real or physical rejection of the Christ. So the rejection of the elements of the law holder's psyche projected onto Christ, who also represents the very structure of the sacrificial nature of creation, identifies the ways in which the law holders reject the sacrificial structure of creation in themselves, and in and through that rejection of the Christ as that symbol, brings about the transformation of the law through the perception of the consequences of its rejection, namely the revelation of God in and through the crucifixion and the resurrection. So if this is the meaning of the narrative of the birth of the Messiah in the soul of the human being, namely this psychosocial transformation through the symbolic representation of the rejected structure of reality as sacrifice, then this structure of the birth of the Messiah in the soul is related then to the meaning of salvation and the meaning of the birth of the Baptist. So the birth of the Baptist of the Messiah is related to the conditions of the perception of the Messiah as such. So the birth of the Baptist of baptizers, a symbol of the natural human being who will lose his head and who is a voice crying out in the wilderness, makes no provision for the flesh, but bears witness to the light of sacrifice. So John represents the perfected ego of the human being who awaits the messianic transformation of personality through the birth and crucifixion and resurrection of the Messiah.